All right, so today we're going to begin an introduction to cultural geography. We are going to spend a little bit of time in class at the end of the first unit on introducing some key concepts and terms from the cultural geography unit. And then later on, we circle back in the year and hit religion and language as areas of study. Sort of that gives us a chance to review a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this unit. So one thing to I want to point you to is pages 30 to 33 of your textbook. They have a lot of what you need to know nicely condensed into 4 pages of textbook. So you've already read this in the first unit, but I do want to sort of key into that and have you circle that and maybe swing back and read that again at the end of this unit, because a lot of important stuff is in that little section. Okay, so what is culture and why do geographers study culture? So culture is defined, and I kind of smushed 2 definitions together, as the material traits, customary beliefs, and social forms that constitute the distinct tradition of a group of people. So I would say my slightly more preferred definition would be shared practices, technologies, attitudes, and behaviors that are transmitted by a society. So what is sort of under the umbrella of culture? So some obvious ones, or some ones that probably immediately come to your mind, are things like language and religion. Those are some of the most visible aspects of culture within a society. But it can also include things like housing styles or the cultural landscape. So what do houses look like? What do places of worship look like? What are the architectural styles that we would associate with a particular society? Also, things like food preferences, the adaptation or the lack of adaptation of certain types of technologies, or different types of technologies based on culture, as well as things like music and sort of elements of popular culture. So, lots to fit under culture, and we only study a little bit of it. We study sort of a broad range of things, but oftentimes not going super in depth on each one of those. So you're going to see some terms we've already started to use in class. The first one is cultural diffusion. So that refers to the movement of cultural traits from one place to another. So we're going to talk a lot about how culture spreads and where it spreads from, and how it spreads, and sort of the different variations and different methods in which culture might spread. So the place that something begins in terms of how culture starts is termed the hearth. So culture will often spread out of a singular hearth. So some terms that come up a lot in here. The first one is folk culture. So these two are sometimes seen as at odds with one another, at kind of opposite terms. And we'll talk about the ways in which folk and popular culture are different. So kind of thinking about folk culture to start with. Kind of what immediately comes to my mind when I think of the term folk culture is, like 60s bands, Bob Dylan, stuff like that. So that's maybe a little bit true, but how it's used in this class is a little bit more to mean like indigenous culture. So culture that's sort of indigenous to a certain geographic area. So examples of that might be slightly endangered or dying languages. So languages that are maybe not widely spread, or only spoken by small groups of people, would be considered an example of a folk culture. Local forms of music or dance. Perhaps certain types of cuisine that are associated with a specific place. Or native religions. So what all 4 of those things in common are, they are kind of more associated with a singular geographic area. They are not super widespread. So the origins of folk culture often can be anonymous or sort of rooted in some long-standing tradition. And they tend to be found more in rural or isolated communities, oftentimes communities of indigenous people. So folk cultures are known for not spreading as widely from the geographic hearth. And we'll talk about that a lot as we talk about cultural diffusion, how elements of culture spread. So on the other hand, we have popular culture. So popular culture, when you what might come to mind there is popular forms of music, or popular sports, the NFL, or the English Premier League, or Korean pop music. All of those things would probably be considered to be popular culture. But it also includes things like major languages and major religions. So English, kind of the world's lingua franca, or the most widely spoken language. Other major languages like Mandarin or Spanish or French would be considered kind of popular culture. Music, food, sports, things like that, that are widespread and have a lot of kind of globalizing effects. And also, we would categorize some of the universalizing religions. So, some of the languages, I'm sorry, some of the religions that are widely spread would be considered to be popular culture as well. So, oftentimes, these have origins that are more known and tend to come from urban areas, not always though. And these are going to be heavily associated with the term called globalization, which is basically, in terms of cultural globalization, meaning something that has spread widely throughout the world and is adopted by many, many different people in many different places. And popular culture often changes or adapts quickly to kind of meet with the times or the ongoing trends in the world. So, two little images to illustrate these concepts. The first one I have is kind of a cool little graphic on um, different instruments that exist within India. So you can see all of these different instruments that exist in different parts of India. Um, so those would be more associated with sort of folk music, sort of associated with a singular geographic area. And on the other hand, we have BTS and apparently this is from 2020, so this is like the world tour that never was. Probably, I assume they didn't go on this. Maybe they did, but I assume they didn't go on this. But this is to illustrate all of the different parts of the world that somebody like BTS would travel to, being sort of the popular culture behemoth that they are. So you can see South Korea, then the United States, and Canada. Then they have this weird question mark that I don't know. That was some sort of mystery place that they would have played in Japan, and then England, and then Germany, Spain, back to Japan. So you have all of these sort of obvious, sort of widespread popularity. So obviously, we would associate popular music with popular culture. All right. So, last term that I want to talk about, just because it leads into the next thing you're going to do, is called the cultural landscape. So, this is always a weird little standard because it is basically what you see when you're analyzing images of places, right? So, what do you notice about how human beings have put their imprint on the physical landscape? So it's defined as the cultural impacts on an area, including buildings, agricultural patterns, roads, signs, and nearly everything else that humans have displayed. So the tie-in that this has to culture is the analysis that a lot of times we do as cultural geographers is to look and see the different ways in which humans create different physical land or cultural landscapes across different places. So to do that, we are going to play a game called GeoGuessr for you to try to guess some of the cultural landscapes that you see. So that'll be next.